box and stuff, does this not have its own structure?
It does.
That's what I
So
thought.
I mean, it's still based on the MVC architecture because React JS here still acts as the web app view and interactive model a little bit better.
Okay.
So the concept, again remains the same, but just a different way of essentially, creating it. And so the main thing to take away from when it comes to React is, which we're actually getting to the main concept here, but the concept of reusability and also only updating certain pieces of the view that you want to be updated as opposed to refreshing the page. So, any other questions? Okay. So I'm hoping everybody still remembers your good friend jQuery. So how is this different than jQuery? Essentially, the application state and UI are updated independently of each other using jQuery. So we can, essentially with jQuery, we can interact with the DOM, we can manipulate the DOM, but it becomes pretty erratic in that each interaction that we have with the DOM, you can see with the image up here, there's a lot of different errors, really going all over the place. With React, it's a little bit different. So instead of interacting with the DOM itself, so React.js will do that for us. So essentially what we do is, we tell React what it is that we need to update, and React is smart enough to then, compare state changes between the current DOM structure versus what we want to change it to, and it allows us to really have React handle that change for us. So essentially, our application's UI is a pure function of its state here. So again, the DOM, so React is essentially its engine essentially efficiently updates the DOM for us so that we don't really have to worry about that. So here, we can see that JavaScript is pretty quick. However, when we update the DOM, the browser needs to recalculate the CSS, the layout, repaint the web page, and so this can become a pretty slow process depending on how intense the page is. If you have, let's say, 15 different API calls, to update one page, or if you're trying to manipulate, certain, pieces of a pretty complex page, it can become very slow. And the browser itself, is only as quick as it can be. So, so essentially, using jQuery compared to React is, there's going to be a pretty big difference here. With React, so React has a virtual DOM, and it essentially serves as an intermediary and avoids unnecessary trips to the DOM. So again, kind of going back to this slide here, React is essentially, React is going to be smarter than us in terms of when to update the DOM, and in terms of efficiency, it can update it much better than we can. So that's main point to take away here. So you guys are probably going like, what right now? Me too, actually. No, I'm just kidding. So I know I'm kind of talking a bit fast here. Is anybody confused about the concept of React or anything of that sort? Does it make somewhat of good sense?
So there is like the actual DOM,
Mhm.
but it's running a virtual DOM on the side, and that's what's being updated.
Yeah. So essentially, whenever we're trying to update a view, based on any sort of user interaction, right? Let's say I click a button and it's supposed to update this view and do something here. So instead of using jQuery to do that, which essentially just updates the DOM itself, what React does is it essentially captures that that change And then using state, which we'll get to a little bit later down the road, React is able to make a better decision in terms of how to update the DOM and when to update it using its own virtual DOM. So it's essentially the virtual DOM is essentially a virtual representation of the actual DOM itself. So does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, and so essentially, this is what this slide covers. So it says the virtual DOM is essentially a JavaScript object that models a real DOM. So whenever some part of our application state changes, it receives the UI updates first, and then the virtual DOM is compared to the real DOM, and then React tries to go ahead and update the actual DOM with the smallest number of changes possible. So. All right, so pros and cons of React. So we'll go through the pros first. First pro here is component-based architecture. Encourage us to break our application's UI into reusable components, which allows us to build more quickly through code reuse. So the concept of reusability, you can really churn out more than one piece of review and use that for a multitude of different things. Our application's UI reactively updates in response to changes to its state, reducing the amount of time, reducing the amount of DOM manipulation code we need to write ourselves. Again, kind of going back to React being able to efficiently update the DOM. Another pro is it can be used to build applications on the web, on the server, and in native applications. Lastly is easier to learn and more popular than other competing JavaScript libraries and frameworks. Some of the cons here, React is just a view library, essentially with rendering user interfaces. While supporting other libraries to accomplish things such as HTTP requests. So, again, this is, React is not something that will allow you to build an entire application. It's really just a library that allows you to, build reusable components to, create a more dynamic view for your application. And then one of the other cons is setting up React can require more configuration than other libraries. It is pretty intense to configure it from scratch, and that's why we have the Create React app for you guys to use. You'll see that when you guys do run it the first time, there is a smorgasbord of files and folders and all that stuff that Create React app generates. Don't be overwhelmed. It is going to be a lot to take in the first time, but we'll go through it piece by piece, and we'll get you guys comfortable with that. So essentially, what do we need to get started? So Webpack. Have we talked about Webpack in this class yet? Nope. Okay. I know you guys know what Babel is, right? Anybody remember what Babel is?
Sure.
What is it?
Oh, screwed up.
Anybody? Bueller?
Imports, exports, around.
Sort of.
From my understanding of it, it seems to be a different way to kind of set up the file system of how you're doing things, and it kind of converts the newer, like the newer script or newer JavaScript to a state that older websites would be able to.
Okay. Yeah. So so essentially, I believe on one of the slides it said that Babel was a compiler. That's not entirely true. What Babel really is what's called a transpiler. Essentially, what Babel is used for here is since React uses a lot of ES6 syntax, or ES6 heavy. What Babel essentially does is it takes it basically, reads through your application, and what it does is it converts all your ES6 syntax to, ES5. So instead of using, import from blah, 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 it'll convert that into, var, whatever equals required and stuff like that. So, yes.
So my question is, what's currently stopping, web browsers from moving to ES6?
I know Chrome handles ES6 just fine. I believe Safari does. The stragglers, mainly Internet Explorer. They don't fully support ES6. I would imagine that a pretty large number of people still use Internet Explorer, for work and stuff like that. Lots of hospitals, any government, institution, they all use super old technology. So, and that's with Internet Explorer kind of being the black sheep here. That's what essentially Babel was designed to do, is to be able to convert essentially newer syntax into older syntax to be able to work on like Internet Explorer and stuff like that. So
I think money was frankly paying so much to
Expensive.
update all that, yeah.
it's very expensive. Yeah. Yeah, I won't be surprised if people are still using like Windows Server 2003 stuff.
I think Microsoft just announced that they're getting rid of Internet Explorer. They're updating to
Yeah.
Edge or Chrome.
Yep, they're going to be using Chromium, which is awesome.
Like 5 years back, the Navy paid millions of dollars to extend support for XP, Windows XP.
It
was like 5 years ago.
More than
Mm-hmm.
7, or not 7, 8.
Well, because they didn't have the money to update.
9, or whatever, 8 to 10.
It's just rough.
It was like 5 years back, so they're halfway through their
I think a lot of people
$1
like
billion
it.
deal.
Seven to
It's
ten.
like a lot more.
When your systems are antiquated, you don't update them.
If XP's good enough to run an aircraft carrier,
Ocelot?
What's that?
It's
if it's good enough to run an aircraft carrier.
I'm just kidding.
Okay, so that's what Babel is. So something new for us to look into is called Webpack. Webpack is essentially a module bundler for modern JavaScript applications. So essentially, when Webpack processes your application, it builds what's called a dependency graph. And it includes every module your application needs in order to run successfully. So all of your require statements, import statements, all that stuff. So essentially Webpack looks for that and essentially builds out a dependency graph so that it knows what dependencies components need, views need, and so forth to actually be loaded by the browser. It allows us to modularize our front-end code in the same way we do in Node with CommonJS modules such as require module exports, etc. It allows us to apply various transformations on our assets through the use of plugins such as Babel. So again, we just talked about Babel. So it's essentially a JavaScript compiler / transpiler. It allows us to transform next generation JavaScript code into ES5 that most browsers will understand. Nowadays, I'm pretty sure all major browsers, apart from IE and Edge, support ES6. I think Chrome probably has the biggest support out of all of them, but I won't be surprised if Firefox and Safari support ES6. But in any event, we'll still be using Babel to transpile all that code for us.
Just a quick question, I forgot, but when did ES6 come out? How's
2015.
2015? Okay,
Its official name actually has 2015 in it.
oh. Cool, so still fairly new.
Sounds old.
Any other questions?
What's the kind of like design, like how long do they usually take with coming out with another version of ES?
Honestly, I'm not sure. It's
3 years, I think.
I guess it just depends, probably not as frequently as like Windows updates. But, I guess it really just depends, you know, in terms of, you know, what kind of new features they're, you know, using and, you know, new technologies and stuff like that. I'm not really sure.
What is the current version of JavaScript?
Will, do you know?
It's not.
Is it ES9?
I think this like falls underneath that. Technically, there's an ES8. But nobody's really using it. It's like alpha, beta stuff. Until something's proven, like right now, ES6 is just getting around to normal, and it's from 2015.
Okay.
Like there's probably like 3 versions that nobody knows about yet, that they're testing new features on.
Okay.
So I don't know what the primary source of truth is for JavaScript, to be honest. It's so,
Well, it's interesting when you
W3C.
look on W3 Schools, because this first version was 97, then 98, then 99, then it took them to 2009 to do the next one, which was ES5. And then 5.1 was like 2011. And then, you know, you got the other versions after that, but it seems like when they first started, there were a lot of close, versions where they were upgrading, but yeah, after that, not a whole lot.
keeping it up until it's ready.
Yeah, it goes to 9, but the tested version.
They have a new version every year now.
I have the same thing. Like, I don't know if it's a pattern.
Well, since 2015.
So moving on. So with JavaScript, with React essentially just being a JavaScript library, you know, you'll probably ask yourself, you know, can I just use a CDN for this? So, you know, similar to, you know, how we were using Bootstrap before. So you can, but it's super slow. You know, again, we can't really dictate the reliability of the CDN that we're using, you know, to pull the React.js libraries. So it's always better just to have, you know, everything pulled in locally into your project to be able to use. And then the NPM package managers, you know, as far as versioning is concerned, we can really manipulate the versioning there. I remember that with Angular, there was a huge change in Angular. I don't even know what the versions are. I think it started off as Angular something, or Angular JS rather. And then the next version after that, it literally was a complete rewrite. And nobody wanted to upgrade because it would take so much extra time, and it was pretty difficult to, you know, move from one version to another. And so, you know, allowing us to, you know, control the versioning is also very good, because then when we want to upgrade, we can obviously see, you know, what we need to perform in terms of, you know, upgrades to a new version. And locally with React, the updates to some of the newer versions, I think when we were in boot camp, it was React version 15.
Somewhere in the 15s.
And now we're up to 16. So it's not much different from when we started, but there are some, you know, some new features here and there that was introduced into the new version of React. But again, not nearly enough to where, you know, it'll cause a whole rewrite. So digging into the docs. For the next, let's see here, for the next 15 minutes, we'll have you guys work in groups, and what we want you guys to do is kind of look through the documentation for React.js, and I would suggest staying in the getting started and main concepts area. Don't veer too far down a rabbit hole that you've never been to, otherwise you will get confused. So yeah, go ahead and take the next 15 minutes to look over the docs, kind of familiarize yourself with React. Does anybody need the links slacked out?
think it's in the history.
Is
The
it?
questions are in the Slack too.
Okay, cool. Alright, so yeah, so take the next 15, familiarize yourself and,
Quiz each other, you guys are answering these questions when we come back. Eric's answering all of
So kind.
Say asking all of them, or?
Yeah, that was my letter. Man, George.
Careful, watch my stack.
Pick on the road.
The global one still on there?
Yeah, I did that already, and I even built that,
Sick.
which is on their thing,
Yeah.
pretty simple thing, but,
SVGs.
Oh.
yeah,
So part one, we are.
That'd be pretty neat.
A lot of animation practice.
yeah, I can't even imagine. The thing I had to get used to was when you create, that it came to start.
For yarn, this whole thing, all the yarn stuff, we didn't talk about that yet. Yarn, and all the same.
Well, let's do the call for another pseudo installation. I remember asking it like, narrow, first question was what are some benefits?
Yeah, pseudo might be needed.
So it's not about
You're the super user, man.
Super user, dude.
You're that guy.
Well, help them steal your laptops, so. Don't ask, don't tell. I know, you make a great videographer.
So speaking of getting stolen laptops,
You can probably pause it while we're doing this.
Pause feature. Huh? I don't have a pause feature on it. It's just continuous.
I got an idea. Why don't you use that as the stick?
He gets all the chairs.
Huh?
He gets all the chairs.
Angle it up.
Even
Steve's, I mean.
Or that.
you can legit get like a diploma. You can get, you can go
Yep.
to this place. What exactly yours or real, but you can get it.
Doctor.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Hammond.
Yeah, I was at Harvard. Full ride. Graduate in 2 years.
You're a lot slower.
Yeah.
We use Vue. Well, React Native is kind of. But for the
guys, I'm
main
gonna stop the
website.
stream real quick. I'm gonna
No.
find a better place to pop this.